Hi, and welcome to the Legal Cheek podcast. I'm Alex Aldridge, publisher of Legal Cheek, and with me is Tom Connelly this week, who's the editor of Legal Cheek.
Good afternoon, Alex.
How you doing, Tom?
Yeah, all good, thank you. All good.
All right, before we kick off, I should remind you that the Legal Cheek podcast is sponsored by Simpson Thatcher, home of the private equity training contract. So, in today's episode, we're going to talk about what the lawyers in Andy Burnham's new cabinet mean for the way he will govern. Because at Legal Cheek, we cover the legal profession in detail. Obviously, there's a strong intersection between law and politics. Lawyers have a tendency to go into politics. But of course, there's many different types of lawyers. There's many kind of there's some legal roles in government, but there's many different types of roles in government requiring different skills. And I think you can actually tell a fair bit from the lawyers that Andy Burnham has picked about, or certainly it gives you hints about um, what he's got in store and his style of governing. Um, just before we sort of get into it, just the lawyers who we've got in the cabinet, just to recap. So, in no particular order, you've got Jonathan Reynolds, who's the coming as business secretary. You've got Ellie Reeves coming as Attorney General. Shabana Mahmood, who's maintains her job as Home Secretary. Douglas Alexander, Scotland Secretary, and then significantly, you've got this non-lawyer, Alex Norris, who's come into the Lord Chancellor role, which is typically done by by lawyers. Um, so I think if we start off with the one who perhaps there's been a bit of controversy around, Jonathan Reynolds. And Tom, you've obviously been following this story for a while.
Yes, thank you, Alex. Yes, Jonathan Reynolds MP. You might have heard of his name. You might not have. If you haven't, the story has just actually gone up on Legal Cheek. It's Tuesday afternoon as we record this, and we've just put a story live about him becoming the new business secretary under Andy Burnham's new cabinet. Now, well, actually, it's actually a wider remit now. He actually is responsible for science as well under his new, slightly longer title. But yes, Jonathan Reynolds MP was a relatively unknown MP until kind of the early start of 2025 when he hit. It was national headlines, and Legal Cheek covered it quite extensively as well when it emerged that some historic posts, including his personal LinkedIn, he'd actually referred to himself as a solicitor. If you're listening to this and asking, well, what's the problem with that? Well, he did complete a law conversion course and did complete the legal practice course, both at BPP Law School in Manchester. And he went on to actually, well, this is the problem. I nearly said complete there, which was which was actually the issue. He started his training contract at the Manchester office of Adelshaw Goddard in 2009, but just 10 months in, so not even halfway. So if you're not familiar with how training contracts work and you're listening to this, it's 24 months, 2 years as a training contract. So he wasn't even halfway through when he decided law wasn't for him, and he was going to pursue a career in politics, and quickly found himself elected as an MP. Now, the issue there is under the Solicitors Act 1974, the title solicitor is actually a legally protected term. So, unlike barrister, where you can actually use the barrister title a little bit more fast and loose, and it's not got the same levels of protection, the solicitor title is very well protected. And only those that are admitted as solicitors, i.e., who qualify and get signed off by the Law Society, are allowed to call themselves solicitors. So, yes, Jonathan Reynolds found himself on the naughty step because he had actually referred to himself as a solicitor on several occasions. He put that down to a bit of an administrative error, particularly in reference to the one on his LinkedIn profile. But it did the press coverage did catch the eye of the Solicitors Regulation Authority. They looked into it. I actually spoke to the SRA yesterday about this. They said that they had looked into it and then subsequently closed the investigation last May, it was. Then they didn't take any further action. So obviously no issues there in terms of Jonathan Reynolds. I think maybe because he wasn't using it to kind of sell legal services or anything like that, it seems to be just a clumsy error on his account that the SRA thought there's no further action required. But more interestingly, and Alex will go into a bit more detail about this, it looks like Andy Burnham has kind of forgiven his use of the word solicitor. He did remain as a business secretary throughout all this saga, I should add. And then he
He
moved
was
across.
he was business secretary before under Starmer,
Yes, he
and
was.
then
Yes, yes,
but
he
then
has.
did he get moved? Because I thought he got moved because of that. No.
Well, there was no public like so. For example, at the time, Keir Starmer didn't say I'm moving Jonathan Reynolds because of this, and actually, the move came in a subsequent reshuffle about 7 or 8 months after all of this kind of blew up. So, reading between the lines, some might argue that the move was as a result of this, and depending on kind of your political leanings and what kind of newspapers you read. Some describe the move to, he was moved to chief whip. Some describe the move as a sideways move. I read a piece in the FT this week that described it as a sideways move. Political blog Guido Fawkes, which is obviously closely aligned with the kind of the conservative movement, they described it very much in quotes a demotion. So it could have been a punishment for kind of bringing embarrassment to the Labour Party, and obviously Jonathan Reynolds cocking this up. So yeah, he was business secretary, moved to chief whip, and now under the Burnham government, he is now back in his new old role, should I say, of business secretary under a wider remit that actually includes some science stuff now as
Yeah.
well.
It is interesting, this one, isn't it? Because um, it's kind of that's quite a big error to call yourself a solicitor when you never actually finished your training contract. I mean, it's in the legal profession, outside the legal profession, sure, it's kind of in the legal profession, um, it's known that you can't do that. You're a trainee solicitor. That's very different from actually being a solicitor. I think he described it as kind of he used it as the term solicitor as shorthand for being, and it's not great to do that. At the same time, you can kind of you can kind of see where he was coming from in that um, the hard part of becoming a solicitor is getting that training contract. Once you get the training contract, the you know you very few people don't then go on to qualify. In fact, it's really quite unusual to finish your training contract, to not complete your training contract, to leave because they're so valuable to get them. It's very unusual to leave. And I mean, I was looking, I thought that's strange. Did he have some kind of personal crisis or falling out or something? But I looked into it, and actually, there was a good reason. He'd been, as you said, Tom, he was elected an MP, which I don't think he necessarily expected. There's a bit on his website saying, it was a really nice surprise kind of thing, and so when you cannot, it kind of makes sense why he had to leave. It's probably one of the very few jobs that people would leave a training contract for. I can't think of many others, but it does make total sense. So there's nothing and to see there in that sense. The other thing that struck me with the timing, it's like 2010. That's just coming out of the financial crisis in 2008. That was a very difficult job market back then, and particularly in the legal sector, they were getting all sorts of trainee solicitors were getting their training contracts deferred, they're getting them cancelled. So to actually have one and then to leave it must be a very, very unusual situation. But as I said, it was for a good reason. He became an MP. That's understandable. The bit that's kind of not so good is saying, albeit it's an error, it's kind of clumsy more than anything. Um, but and I guess it shows you there's a couple of things that it shows you. I suppose it shows that Andy Burnham is kind of fairly forgiving. I mean, the other one, high profile situation. We're not going to talk about this in detail now, but it's Louise Hay. his kind of right-hand woman has a fraud conviction. Um, so again, there's we're not going to go into that now, but the fact is that Burnham has decided to look through that. Obviously, the John Reynolds thing isn't it's nothing it's nothing like as serious as that, but it's a bit of an error, and he's decided to let that go. But perhaps more importantly is what business experience does Jonathan Reynolds have? Because this is maybe what you really do see the lack of kind of people with business experience um, available for Andy Burnham to pick in his cabinet. Because if you look at Jonathan Reynolds, yeah, he left his training contract out of Goddard 10 months, and then he goes to become an MP, and then he's essentially a career politician from that point on, from 2010. And actually, it would have been really useful if he'd have had some experience at Aldershot Goddard, you know, working with businesses in Manchester and around the UK as a solicitor. I mean, that would be so useful given the lack of that sort of talent in the Labour government. I mean, imagine if he'd have stayed around there, become a partner at Aldershot Goddard. That experience would be so valuable. I think that's what we really saw with, I mean, with Rachel Reeves and her wider team, that kind of lack of business experience was regularly criticised. And Burnham coming in, wouldn't it be great if he could call on someone with more business experience than like 10 months working for a solicitor's firm in 2010? Um, and if you look at actually, um, who's actually available for Labour with kind of people with a kind of business background. There are a couple of good ones, and maybe you would question. I mean, the ones that kind of stand out who didn't make it into cabinet positions are Chris MacDonald, who worked for Tata Steel, and Ian Murray, who worked for Aegon and has started a number of businesses. Um, and yeah, they didn't make it um, into any of these kind of senior positions, and you kind of wonder why that is. Um, but generally speaking, there's not um, a lot of kind of business talent in this government, and of course, a lot of lawyers, their roles do very much overlap with business, like working for Aldershot Goddard. That is a commercial law firm. You're working with business all the time. And yeah, you wonder why are not partners at big law firms who earn, you know, very large sums of money. Often they retire early. And in fact, there's a convention of partners at city law firms retiring about 55. They'd be perfect to go into politics. But there's few of them few of them actually do. And when you talk, they don't need the money. People say, oh, is it the salary, the relative, the fact you can earn lots more in business, is that what's stopping people going into politics? But yeah, I mean, these people from city law firms and big corporate law firms, they're they're in a financial position. They're totally comfortable. They're made for life. They can retire at 55. It would be great to see more of them going into politics, and yeah, you just don't see them. Um,
Isn't
Certainly in
there
the
a
Labour
isn't there
Party.
a, isn't there a slight irony, Alex, that you talk about the partners at firms? I imagine that in some of the elite US firms where these partners work, their trainees are probably on similar salaries to the people that are in this
Yeah,
cabinet now.
yeah. It's crazy. It's crazy, and I mean yeah, yeah. But they'd be in a position they could really do it anyway. So that was Jonathan Reynolds. Um, Next one is Ellie Reeves, Tom, who's coming as Attorney General.
Yes, yes, Ellie Reeves. She was already part of the government because she previously held the role of Solicitor General, which comes with the added bonus that she now gets to call herself a KC, so honorary albeit, but KC nonetheless. Um, she is a lawyer by trade, or more specifically, a barrister. Very well educated, studied law, at Oxford, as many barristers in London have done. Completed her pupillage at the London Set 12 King's Bench Walk, according to her LinkedIn. Um, Seems to have moved from the employed bar quite to the employed bar, should I say, quite quickly. So she actually worked at various law firms in-house, as it were, as an in-house barrister. She specialised in employment law, so obviously not a huge commercial link there, but obviously she could be handling, the employment matters of commercial entities. It's not particularly clear from her bio where her specialisms were. Um, Worked her way up and eventually became a partner at a London law firm, not a huge city law firm, I should add, but a firm called OH Parsons. Wasn't one I heard of until I did my research, but they seem to be quite a small London outfit. So she obviously worked her way up to partner, and then interestingly pivoted away from that into politics in 2017. Um, and she's held a number of roles, both legal and non-legal, in the government. I just had a quick look there. So Minister without portfolio was one of them, and then she was actually chair of the Labour Party for a period, and more recently, like I said, she was the Solicitor General. And usually the natural progression of things is if you're the Solicitor General, eventually you would see yourself move up to the Attorney General, which is essentially the government's top law office or top lawyer, and that is the role that she now sits in. Um, and yes, so we've had quite a few lawyers that obviously hold that role, very prominent ones. Seems to be a bit of a mix from both the bar and the solicitors profession. The previous person that she replaces is obviously Hermer, whose first name escapes me now. Was it Richard Hermer? Is it Richard?
Just
Richard Hermer. I feel.
Richard, I think.
Let me
Yeah,
double check that just so I
yeah,
don't get Richard's name wrong. But yeah, it was Richard Hermer, Baron Hermer,
yeah.
who was obviously a very formidable barrister before he then moved into politics. He was actually full time at Matrix Chambers, and fellow barrister Sakir Starmer, who was of Doherty Street, has poached him out of Matrix to come work for the government, and he was there for. I'm not sure how long he served for, probably close to 2 years, I would imagine.
Yeah, I think he did come in at the beginning. I think the problem with Lord Hermer, and it was he'd kind of become a bit of a hate figure on the right.
Mm,
And he did come in at the beginning with Starmer, and I know that because I went to a talk that he did just when the Starmer government had come in, and it was at Gray's Inn, and he was kind of speaking to the press about his plans, and everyone was. I think there was quite a few media there because it was an opportunity, a bit like now, really, an opportunity to kind of get some hints about what the new government would be like. And what really struck me then was how Lord Hermer seemed to he he's he seemed to think that a lot of the problem with the previous governments had been their lack of respect for the rule of law, which was obviously there's some truth in that. Um, and with the kind of particularly Boris Johnson, Program Parliament, etc., etc. And there was a strong sense that he gave that I perceived anyway in that talk was that if you fix that lack of respect for the rule of law, a lot of stuff will flow from there that yields surprisingly good results. Right through everything from kind of including kind of from a kind of business perspective in that it would reattract international business to the UK, etc., etc. And I do remember going away from that talk and thinking, "Ooh, I hope that's not their kind of big idea because I'm not sure if that's gonna be enough." And it's apparently Herma is very close to Starmer. They're good friends and obviously former colleagues. And one of the things of the Starmer government was a kind of lack of ideas, lack of big ideas, and I do wonder if that was their big idea, and does now in hindsight look like they were a bit complacent. Um, I mean, it's not. I don't think Ellie Reeves is kind of expected to bring big ideas in that sense. She's probably more of a safe pair of hands who is not. Um, um, who they probably hope is not going to be kind of like a hate figure like Herma became to some on the right. Um, you know, you mentioned to pupillage, Tom. It was that kind of civil chambers. I mean, people talk a lot about human rights and how Herma was obsessed with human rights. I mean, kind of human rights touches kind of all areas of law, and um, you'd expect Ellie Reeves to have kind of a similar respect for the rule of law, but perhaps she's starting with a fresh slate, so she'll get more um, patience from the press. Of course, she's Rachel Reeves' sister. I mean, she's very much a kind of politician in her own right. It seems to be a very political family, and the two of them have obviously pursued politics. So yeah, not like mega interesting there. Then we've got Shabana Mahmood, who stayed as Home Secretary, and she was a barrister, Tom.
Yeah, I believe so. It was
Mm,
funny because you mentioned this.
mm.
I missed the sorry, just let me bring up my notes. Yeah, I'd missed that had kept her appointment, but again, she obviously studied at Oxford, did the bar course at what the Inns of Court School, which has rebranded, but has then gone back to it, and then yeah, she I think her dalliance with law was pretty brief,
Pretty brief.
from what I
Similar to
understand.
Ellie Reeves, actually. She was actually at the same chambers as Ellie Reeves, and then ended up being an employed barrister working for law firms, went into politics. Um, Again, I mean, I say less interested because she's remained in post. I'm not sure how much we learned from that. I suppose the big story is that she um, didn't become Chancellor of the Exchequer. Um, but but um but yeah, and which would have been slightly odd because she didn't have any financial experience really. But then we got Douglas Alexander, Scotland Secretary. Again, was a solicitor, worked for kind of firms representing unions. It's kind of what you'd expect from Labour. He's maintained his position. But then the final one is again kind of started with maybe the most interesting, finishing with another interesting one is Alex Norris, who's a non-lawyer, but he's become Lord Chancellor, which is the kind of alongside Attorney General is the kind of legal role. And again, Tom, you've covered stories about this role in quite a lot of detail over the years.
Yeah, absolutely, Alex. I've written probably about 6 or 7 different Lord Chancellors over my time. Alex Norris MP being the latest one. Like you say, Alex comes from a non-legal background. I should just start by saying he replaces the previous Lord Chancellor, which was David Lammy, who was a qualified barrister and was an associate tenant at Doughty Street Chambers, also the former chambers to the person that employed him, Sir Keir Starmer. He studied politics and history, Alex Norris MP, and then actually went straight into work for Nottingham Council. And then he worked for Unison, which is obviously the public trade service union, as an organizer. Um, then pivoted into kind of the full-time politics in 2017 and became the MP for Nottingham North. Now, he doesn't have a legal background, but that isn't actually unusual for people in this role. There was a previously a requirement for them to be legally qualified, and then a new act. Well, I say a new act. It was a new act at the time in 2005. The Constitutional Reform Act came in, which basically separated the role of the Lord Chancellor and the head of judiciary because they were actually one role, which opened the door for non-lawyers to take up the role. Now, for the first few years after that act was in place, no party did actually put a non-lawyer into that role until fast forward to 2012, I believe it was, when Chris Grayling, for the Conservative government, he became the first non-lawyer Lord Chancellor to take up the position. For legal cheek readers that have been reading us for back in 2012, I remember writing stories about Chris Grayling. I'm sure you'll recall how his tenure when he didn't exactly ingratiate himself with lawyers.
He wasn't. He had a tough. I mean, he wasn't popular, was he? But that was very kind of Tory austerity years when a lot of the focus of the cuts was on the funding to the legal profession, legal aid. Actually, looking back, they didn't save a huge amount and they caused absolute chaos. And Grayling was the guy wielding the axe. And I think they felt by bringing a kind of non-lawyer in, would kind of promote kind of fresh sort of thinking. But we talk about hate figures. I mean, he was a hate figure, wasn't he? Oof, the people did not like him.
Yeah, and it didn't seem to bother him either. He seemed to
Seemed
be,
to thrive on it. He seemed to like, yeah.
yeah, he did. He really just he didn't care. And then obviously he went on to do other things, including kind of transport and all sorts. And issues seemed to follow him around, but he didn't seem to bother him. But he wasn't the only conservative Lord Chancellor who was not from a non-legal background, because obviously following Grayling, they had Michael Gove. Um, and
Quite a popular Lord Chancellor, as I remember actually go, wasn't he?
yeah, I mean, he was following Chris Grayling, so he's
Yeah, that's
I think he was always onto a winner with that appointment. But he seemed to have a bit more of a caring approach, whereas Chris Grayling was very much cuts, cuts, cuts. Michael
mm,
Gove seemed to be a bit more measured in his assessment of it.
certainly a
Um,
better communicator.
yeah, for sure, for sure. And then following Michael Gove, there was, and I completely forgot that the former PM herself, albeit very briefly, Liz Truss, was
Oh yeah, she was, wasn't she? Yeah.
yeah, she was in that role,
Yeah.
albeit not for a huge amount of time, and it always seemed that she had aspirations for bigger and better things in terms of government.
Yeah.
So it didn't she didn't kind of ruffle too many feathers with lawyers. And then again, following her, David Liddington,
Yes.
again didn't he sort of kind of his tenure in that role seemed to pass without much fanfare. Again, I'd forgotten that he'd taken that role. So they were all non-lawyers, but the I guess the significance for Alex Norris is from my research, I believe he's the first non-lawyer appointed by the Labour Party into this role. So that's significant in itself.
Yeah, sort of strange when in a party that's got so many lawyers to kind of you may as to put a non-lawyer in that role. You'd almost think you may as well just put in one of your lawyers. But I guess it's interesting about because David Lammy was kind of quite controversial, when he came in, I think people thought, oh, David Lammy, he'll be a friend of lawyers here, whereas actually with his some of his work around jury trials and reducing the amounts of time there'll be a jury is kind of did some of the legal profession objected to that very, very strongly.
Yeah,
Um,
no, that I remember writing that story, and that really, particularly obviously the criminal bar were really unhappy with it, and I think they were quite surprised because David was one of their own, and they thought,
yeah,
well, he understands the mechanics of how justice works, how important and integral a jury trial is to justice, being judged by your peers, and here's David Lammy coming along, a qualified barrister at Doughty. Well, he's an associate tenant at Doughty Street Chambers, which is seen as very forward-thinking, set rule of law, justice. And
mm,
here he is coming along and just saying, well, try to tear up us effectively the rule book. It'll be quite interesting to see, what David does next, whether he stays in politics or whether he's potentially welcomed back at Doughty Street after
yeah.
proposing those kind of cuts.
I guess the other side of it is you could argue that it needed a lawyer to make those cuts because it would only be a lawyer who worked in that area who realized how badly the court system was funded and quite how serious the backlogs were and the fact that I mean the delays on some of the criminal trials are just incredible and just how it it needed some radical surgery to change it. I'm not saying I agree with that. I'm just saying there's probably two sides to the story. But I mean, when it comes to Alex Norris as a non-lawyer, I mean, what stands out for me, he was involved in kind of um, sort of immigration, um, and I guess politically, obviously, Starmer cut the number of migrants coming into the country quite quite drastically, actually. And I suppose with one eye to the election in a couple of years, maybe Burnham is thinking to have a person who was involved in reducing immigration numbers, very visible as Lord Chancellor, might be kind of politically quite helpful to him. So I suspect that link could be could be quite important in terms of why it was chosen. Um,
I thought it was quite interesting if you didn't know Alex's background, to try and work back, trying to guess his background based on the roles he's had, because obviously you mentioned he was responsible for border security and asylum, but he's also been the Under Secretary of State for Building Safety, Fire, Under Secretary of State for Local Growth. He was the Shadow Minister for Levelling Up, Shadow Minister for Policing. So he seems to be a bit of a Swiss Army knife when it comes to politics. So maybe Burnham has seen something in that and thought, "Well, do you know what? Let's throw him into the Justice Secretary role and see what he can do." But like you say, the link maybe between asylum, but obviously Minister for Policing as well. There might be some slight overlap there with Justice. You might have seen some exposure to the courts. And what I thought was really interesting, and that I picked up on this on X, was that someone pointing out that barristers might not want to breathe a sigh of relief that Lamy's gone and he'll be taking his kind of proposals about jury cuts with him, because someone had pulled up some tweets from I think it was kind of earlier this year, where Alex Norris had sort of kind of signaled his support for these jury cuts. So I guess only time will tell whether Alex will pick up from where Lamy left off.
Interesting. I mean, what could be interesting there is kind of the intersection with AI. Like, obviously Starmer's picked a minister for AI, and there's a lot going on in the legal tech space, and you think that it could be a golden opportunity for a forward-thinking Lord Chancellor to start to tackle some of the funding issues using technology. It's just problem is though, I think when you chop and change cabinets and so much, and it must be how much can you actually achieve? And this was one of the problems with the Tory party. They kept changing the roles. As you said, Tom, like the number of stories we had about new Lord Chancellors, new Attorney Generals, and I mean that was the Tories were constantly changing. And every time that changes, like the kind of the boss of that department is gone, and then there's a reorganization. And I mean it's an incredibly inefficient way to operate. And then you get a different government coming in, and they signaled at the beginning, oh, it's all going to be calm. And now 2 years in, it's all ripped up, and there's new people coming in. And I suppose what stands out with all these appointments collectively is, I mean, they're fine, but then it's not like they're amazing kind of Lionel Messi type world class politicians coming into these roles. I mean, they're just none of them are particularly objectionable. I mean, there's some question marks over, we mentioned Jonathan Reynolds with the describe himself as a solicitor thing, but I mean, it's not such a big deal. But the others are all just kind of fine. Is it worth really all the upheaval just to change it again? What can they realistically expect to achieve before the next election, which at the longest to be 3 years away, might be sooner. Um, and I think everyone and sort of British citizen wishes them well, but it doesn't inspire confidence to have so many changes, I think is my takeaway from this, Tom.
Yeah, I take your point, and it's funny you use about nothing ever getting really done because everything's chopping and changing. If you sort of put that into like a law firm structure analogy, and you're like a trainee, and it's like your partner or your supervisor that you're working under is changing every kind of 10 months or a year. It must be just absolutely chaotic as a civil servant working
Yeah.
in one of these departments, because obviously a new person comes in, they want to put their stamp on things, they roll out potentially all these ideas, and then they presumably get shelved, and then there's a new change. And like you say, nothing really gets, everyone's just sort of treading water. But I wonder, maybe maybe this is a statement from Andy Burnham, that he wants to, put his own cabinet together. He doesn't want to kind of get the leftovers isn't the right phrase, but he wants to kind of separate himself from Keir Starmer a little bit and say, well, this is the Andy Burnham era. And maybe he's looked around and thought, well, there's not a huge amount to pick from, particularly from the business side of things. But he has, like you say, and we've talked about this already, so I won't repeat it too much, but there are some interesting people that he's sort of left out. And you do think, why is that? And maybe there's just more at play that we just don't know about.
Yeah, yeah, I'm sure. But in terms of giving our sort of insider knowledge of kind of legal industry and how it plays into politics, I mean, that's our analysis of it, and it's going to be interesting to see how things play out. The Legal Cheek podcast is sponsored by Simpson Thatcher, home of the private equity training contract, and we will be back with you soon. Cheers.